welcome to everyone. I'm glad they put us in a bit of a bigger room. That way, David doesn't have to haul in all the extra chairs. They're already here. I want to say that I want to point out first the graphic for this. I don't know how many of you noticed this, but the first talk was faith. How do we lose it? And it showed the solid part of the graphic with it being lost on the right-hand side. And then this was faith, how do we get it back? You'll see the faith that's been scattered and disseminated, and now it's coming back together into a form. I found that. I didn't create it. I found it by saying, perfect. You're sort of visually representing what I want to stress in this. The first part of my presentation yesterday dealt with the theories, sort of the ideas that underscore what I'm going to talk about today, which are the practical things we can begin to do in order to have faith be reestablished, reaffirmed, reconfigured, and come back into some shape. After what I said yesterday, a lot of people could have the idea that I was going to be a real sort of David Downer and talking about the future of religion, and especially Orthodoxy in particular. But the fact is, there are many signs of hope, as well as indications that the faith is dwindling and scattering. There are also indications that faith is coming into a new configuration and becoming rejuvenated in new and very creative ways. So that will be the emphasis of my talk today. I also was told by people, leave some time for questions at the end. But once I get started, I have a hard time getting stopped. So I'll try to have some time at the end for questions and answers and discussions. Okay by you? Okay. All right. So faith, questioned and challenged in so many ways in contemporary society. How do we reestablish it? How do we resecure it? How do we get it back? All right, the main point, and this is sort of a summary statement from what I said yesterday, for those of you who may not have been there or may have already forgotten what we talked about then. All right, remember I started by talking about the work of C.S. Lewis and how he took a word we use all the time, love, and he really did a sort of dissection of the term and showed the various ideas that were really involved in love. It's much more complicated than just a singular sort of homogeneous idea. I wanted to do that with faith. Faith is another one of those terms we use a lot, and we don't realize there are many aspects, many components, many perspectives that are involved in a complete understanding of faith. So I wanted to do that. And so what I emphasized in the first talk was this faith is multifaceted, involving a set of interrelated components. There are two major aspects of faith. The first is faith of the mind. All right? There's a mental, intellectual, theoretical component of faith that focuses on knowledge of doctrine. All right? And that's usually, when we're talking about belief, that's usually what we focus on. In seminaries, that's what they spend all the time trying to inculcate in the students, an understanding of the history and the theory of doctrine. But there's also another major component, and that's the relational aspect of faith. There's not only the aspect of the mind, but of the heart. And this has to be kept in mind in dealing with faith holistically, as a whole that has to be understood. And I quoted, whenever in doubt, find a quote from Metropolitan Callisto Swear, and your idea is canonized as automatic truth. And in his glossary in the Philokalia, under pistis, which is the Greek word usually translated as belief or faith, he says it's not only an individual or theoretical belief in the dogmatic truths of Christianity, these are his words now, not mine, but an all-embracing relationship, an attitude of love and total trust in God. And the one image, I'm sure, you remember from yesterday's when I had the $20 bill, and I said if I rip it in half and take it to the bank, and I said I want $2 $10 for this half of a $20 bill, it'd say get lost. All right? That's the way we deal with faith. We tend to look at only half of it and forget the other half. We tend to look at the faith of the mind and not of the heart. I want to sort of open the bill and have both of those aspects emphasize what I'm talking about. If any of the components is lacking, faith loses its functionality. And that's really what we're concerned about. How is faith functioning in our life? It becomes feeble, brittle, anemic, unstable because of the affirmation corrosives of faith. And we talked about some of the things that once faith in culture becomes threatened, there are all these forces, all of these pressures of the society that corrodes the faith. All right? So that's a summary, a very brief summary of what I did last time. So the implication in all of that is this. All this implies that the only way to regain faith is to overcome our falsely reductionistic view of faith as a matter of knowledge and intellectual assent. Remember, that's of the mind. And to restore its other components, especially trust, entailing obedience. And remember, we saw in the linguistic study in Greek and in even Christian thought in the West that you have this idea that faith and trust are linguistically interrelated. And so a major aspect of faith that many of us lose is we don't have really an active trust in God or in other people. And therefore our faith in God or other people begins to disintegrate. So we're going to look at ways how to repair that, how to reverse that. But the question that automatically arises, how can this be done in a secular context where trust is disintegrated? Remember, I asked you, and I saw a lot of nodding at this point, what do people really trust in these days? Do they trust in the government? Do they trust in politicians? Do they trust in medical officials? Do they trust in the economy? Do they trust in sometimes even their own families? Do they trust in the church? Do they trust in the clergy? We're living in a culture where trust is challenged, and even if you're raising kids, you have to ask yourself, how trusting do I want my children to be? And this is something that I think undercuts the religious idea of faith because trust ends up getting undercut. All right, so how do we begin to approach this? Here's the good news. Interest in faith and in religion is still there. The fact that you're here listening to me babble on this afternoon and coming to these conventions and these conferences show that there's still a yearning, still a thirst that people want to have quenched. The interest in religion is not gone, but people are insisting it better be authentic, better not be fake. It has to be something I can depend on, something I can trust in, something I can believe in. But the motivation to have that is still there. People are still seeking a renewed faith. All right, the word religion, by the way, the English word religion, comes from the Latin verb religere. This is what most etymologists think. Religere in Latin means to bind together. You have all these separate things that need to be gathered and sort of tied together so that they all fit in one bunch. I asked you, isn't that what a lot of people are looking for today? I'm not going to be crude about it. You fill in the blank in your mind, I'm not going to say it. How many times I've heard people say to me, Father, my life is so scattered, I really need to get my blank together. All right? I think that almost every day when I wake up. I need to get my blank together. Religion, historically, as a cultural force, was what enabled people to do that. Whatever the problems were, whatever the challenges were, and the good things too, what bound them together was a religious worldview that held the good with the bad and showed ways out of situations that needed to be addressed. And listen, most of us came from ethnic backgrounds where, remember, our parents, our grandparents, they didn't have the intellectual component of faith so much. They couldn't define any doctrine if their life depended on it. But they trusted and they believed, and their life became a whole, a totality. And then they educated their children, my parents, and then their grandchildren, and it all began to fall apart. But the urge to find that binding together is still there. And that's why religion is not going to go away. One of my secular, anti-religious colleagues used to say, what's the study of religion? It's like the study of geology, that geologists do. Except people who study religion don't realize that geologists don't want the rocks to go away. People who study religion in a secular way without understanding the function of religion wish it almost that it would disappear. It's not going to disappear. Religion, even if people reject religion, you've got to take something seriously to reject it. All right? So it's not going to go away. And so we have to understand what it is that makes it functional and something that people really do want. This is an article. I gave you all those articles that talked about the disintegration of religion. A new study uncovers overlooked religious phenomena. Identity inconsistent worship attendance. What does that mean? People are going to churches that are not the ancestral church of their family. So people like Pulcini begin to examine Orthodox. All right? People whose last name is something that is Irish are looking to Orthodoxy. Half of the Buddhists in my college where I taught in Pennsylvania, there were many converts to Buddhism. None of them was from an Asian, either East Asian or South Asian background. All of the leadership of the Buddhist community were Europeans in their background. That means there are a lot of people who are looking into religion that are not consistent with their legacy of religion in their family, which shows that there's a real openness. So with all the negativity about people leaving religion, there's this positive thing that people are open to possibilities that a generation ago would not have been considered in their families. Kadesh, do you understand what I'm saying there? There's a real opportunity for conversion, a real opportunity for change of perspective and openness for all kinds of new perspectives. That's a sign for hope. And we're benefiting from that in Orthodoxy today. There is a YouTube podcast that you should look at by Father Andrew Damon. And it's called The Surge into Orthodoxy. If you want to take a picture of that link, you can look at it. And he examines what we've already talked about in a couple gatherings that I've been attending during this conference, about how all these new people are coming into the church, sometimes overwhelmingly so. What is leading to that? And he gives a very balanced analysis of it. He said, it's not as if we all have to hire crowd control people in our churches on Sunday. That's not happening everywhere. But there is something happening where the surge is a reality and needs to be examined. And here's the other thing. New spiritual ways. 19 ways to rekindle your faith in God. Again, that's from a publication, Critical Financial. I always wonder why they're doing religious studies in Critical Financial. But there's money in religion, I guess that's one reason. But the thing is, people are saying now, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. There you go, I hear that all the time. And let me tell you, people are emphatically spiritual. And they're emphatically anti-religious. Now, there's an inconsistency there. But what it shows to me is there's a suspicion of religion. When people say, oh, I'm not in favor of organized religion, I always say, boy, do I have a church for you. This idea of, in all the institutions, trappings, but the hunger, the thirst, the need to have something to bind together all those loose ends of my life, that's not going anywhere, and I'm spiritual and I'm searching for it in new ways that I would never have thought of and that my ancestors showed me. So this is a sign for hope. There's also another article that I found recently, America's Spiritual Revolution, turning away from Christianity to embrace alternatives. But I want to tell you what my conviction is. What they're looking for in the alternatives is there in Christianity, but it has never been presented in a way that responds to the questions people have. I have a basic rule of my life. You know what the 2 rules are? Never give answers to questions you haven't been asked. The other thing is, listen to the questions that people are asking and come up with convincing responses to those questions. There are people asking questions. We tend to give them answers that aren't responding to the questions they're asking and wonder why they lose interest. But the fact is, the interest is there. We have to hear the questions and then come up with convincing responses based on inherently Christian and in our case, Orthodox sources. And you'd be surprised at what's there. For instance, let me give you an example. You can answer this one easily. All those students I talked about who are becoming Buddhists, what do you think attracted them to Buddhists as a practice that helped them in their day-to-day life? If you had to guess.
Order,
Or, someone said it, meditation. So, have they ever heard of the Jesus prayer? No. And you can chant Om, you could say the Jesus prayer and have an altered state of consciousness, which is exactly the same thing they're looking for. But they never had that kind of knowledge that there was that resource for meditative sort of expansion of the mind and of the spirit in Christianity. You see, we have resources that we have not been able to present in a way that responds to questions, genuine questions, good questions that people have. So how should we respond to this subcurrent of resurgent interest? And here's where I want to give some very specific, practical things that I think we can do to respond to the challenges to faith, both of the mind and of the heart. And let me look into it. First of all, how can we cultivate the intellectual, the mind aspect of faith? Okay, the pressing need for adult religious education. Boy, I've made a lot of mistakes typing here. With apologetics emphasis. All right, someone's going to shoot me, so if they do, please forgive me if I've offended anyone. I think in many ways we have our religious education programs in parishes backwards. We spend so much time, so much energy, so much money in dealing with religious education of children, all right? But the people who really have the questions that need answers from the faith are adults, all right? In other words, if we spent 1/2 of the time and the effort and the administrative worries we have in dealing with adults that we do with children, it would transform church life. The only education that works is education that answers questions that people have. People have a lot more questions when they're adolescents and adults than they do when they're pre-adolescents. People come to discussion groups that are going to be able to address the issues they're facing in a way that a 4th grader or a 5th grader is not going to come into a Sunday school class filled with zeal to listen. That's the first thing. The other thing I want to mention here is it should have an apologetics emphasis. I taught college for 40 years. I am sick and tired of people saying college education is the enemy of religion. First of all, that is just not true in most cases. There was a monk who wrote an article against university professors. I went ballistic when I read it. And I called Bishop Thomas and I said, why are you sending this to all the clergy? He said, you don't like it? Write a response. So I did. All right? I said, you ruined my whole day. He said, but I can tell that you feel cleansed and purged every day. I said, yeah, now I just need to take the rest of the day off. But I said this was my major point in the article, to assume that all university professors are anti-religion and anti-faith is simply not true. That's a falsehood, first of all. And if you're going to be able to maintain your religious perspective and the religious worldview, you have to understand the other perspective and understand how you can respond to it. You can't respond to something you don't understand. So to know, who was it? I think Tip O'Neill said, I keep my friends close and my enemies closer. And I think that that's what we need to do with religion as well. If there are challenges to religion, intellectual challenges, academic challenges, you have to understand the philosophical and the historical challenges. this is what it says: always be prepared to make an apologia, a defense to anyone who calls you to account for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and reverence. That one quote gives an ideal formulation for what adult religious education should be preparing our college students and adults to do. Apologia doesn't mean apology, it means a defense, right? Always be prepared to offer defense to anyone who calls you to account for the hope that is in you. That means they ask you, how are you able to deal with this in life? How are you able to deal with the challenges that you face? How are you able to do that? They ask you, and you have to have ready. Notice they ask you a question first. Not like the person who comes up to you in the supermarket when you're buying butter and say, are you saved? No one invited that question. I remember I said to someone once, the only thing I want to be saved from is you asking me this question. But the fact is, if someone genuinely does ask the question about why you are what you are and how you behave, why you behave this way, you should have a defense, a careful defense formulated. That's what the apologia is. And you need the knowledge to be able to do that. And do it with gentleness and reverence. I had an argument with one of our priests who's from a much more sort of extreme view of things than I am. And I says, in terms of content, you and I are pretty much on the same page. I think the substance of our faith is very much similar. Problem is, you bludgeon people with your stance. I have never in my life met someone who was bludgeoned into conversion. If someone hits them over the head with this stance saying how wrong they are and how right I am, what you do is you tune them out and adopt the stance that's going to aggravate them the most. All right? So this passage from 1 Peter, I think the first thing we have to do in effectively cultivating the intellectual aspect of faith is do exactly what it says in 1 Peter. Always be ready for an apologia. That means you need to be informed and informed intellectually to be able to do it, and then do it with gentleness and with reverence. For instance, I teach a Bible study once a week. When I was teaching on the faculty of Dickinson, as a faculty member, I couldn't do pastoral work with students. That would be a conflict of interest, all right? People were saying, you got a professor trying to convert people. So I stayed away from any official sort of ministerial role when I was faculty. But now that I'm retired, I don't have to worry about what the dean or the president says. So I do this. I have a Bible study every Saturday afternoon during the academic year between 1:30 and 2:30. I was said, no one's going to come to this. A Saturday? I had 5, 10, 15 students show up. And what they were showing up for is because their faith was challenged, but they needed the raw material and the data that would help them to come up with an apologia for defending their faith. It was the most rewarding teaching experience I had in years. Why? Because they came brimming with questions and a receptivity to the answer. And they like my stories. And when the stories about body, they like the numbers even went up and down. But I have to tell you that that's what good education is about. The OCF on the campus has had probably the most remarkable influence that I've had in my pastoral work of education. And we do a liturgy on campus now. I do a liturgy on campus once a month. It started with 5 people. Last one we had, the last academic year, there were 50 people there. So, and I still don't have the new antiments yet, so I have to get one of those at some point. So this is something that I think if you engage in a kind of formation of the mind that really responds to questions, that encourages the intellectual aspect of faith. Never fear, our archdiocese is filled with talented people. In the Antiochian House of Studies praxis projects, which I vet and evaluate each semester, and 123 of them this past semester, there is so much talent out there. It's amazing to me. And so many good, insightful ways of people packaging and presenting the faith in real response to real questions. Just amazing to be able to see that. The projects, that's a legal point. Some people, I tell them about the projects, they say, could you send me that project? And I don't know, someone who's a lawyer here has to advise me, how do I get the permission of the person who did the project to share it with others? Because some of these things really should be marketed for widespread use. For instance, just to give you one example, one of my students, I think some of the preschool understand this, is from a parish where they have all these converts coming in, all right? And they had, at one point, close to 30 catechumens. Some of them have never opened a Bible. They didn't know who Abraham was. They didn't know who Adam was, all right? Then, among the 30, they had students who were graduates of Protestant seminary programs who had hemmed in. They're all coming in, and they're all interested in becoming Orthodox. Different approaches have to be used to those different kinds of people. And he developed the software for developing the different responses. Very helpful. And I've had a number of people saying, give me that. I said, I can't until I check the legality of it. But I think that's something that indicates how these projects can be very responsive. Parish examples, I just want to give you one thing. I did two things in parish religious education. Sunday school classes, maybe I hope all of you priests have different experiences from what I have. But you have Sunday school programs, you have dedicated teachers who prepared lessons, then they'll have 5 students come one week, and then the next week another different 5, and then the third week no one comes at all, and the number of people in Sunday school goes way down. So you know what I did? I started a homeschooling Sunday school program where the parents had to be the teacher for the first, second, third, fourth, fifth grade students with the OCEC materials, but the parents had to read the text and then explain it to their children. And I had a chart, nice chart, where every time you filled out a form that your kid did this lesson, they got stars. And of course that becomes a competition. And everyone wants to have as many stars next to their kids' names as possible. One person came to me and said, I've learned more in doing that third grade OCEC text than I've learned in years, because I had to read it, understand it, and explain it to my child. And because I was spending time with my child to do it, they knew I was taking it seriously. And then the second thing I did is, I had an adult study group. And we used these little books put out by a monk on Mount Athos. They're very thin, maybe 30 pages. And we would read a section together, like the Orthodox view of illness, the Orthodox view of death and dying, the Orthodox view of anger, very practical things. I never gave assigned reading because people would never do assigned reading. But they were short books, and so what we did, we would read a couple pages and discuss it. The number of people who came on a Wednesday night, outside of Lent, I would have it, approach 40 and 50 people, adults. So people do have questions, but you have to hear the questions and you have to formulate the questions in a way that is using good sources. Okay, again, cultivating the intellectual mind aspect. The need for providing training in asceticism. All right, this is a challenge that I want to work on, and any of you can help me with this. To be Orthodox, you must become, to some extent, an ascetic. Bishop Basil once said something I'll never forget. He said, there is no orthodoxy without asceticism, without a spirit of self-denial and self-discipline. You know what? We expect a lot from our spiritual charges, especially college students that I'm used to dealing with. If they are going to abide by the church's teaching, they have to have a commitment to self-discipline and asceticism. If they're going to follow, to use a blatant example, and don't be scandalized by this, if they're going to follow the church's teaching on sex and sexuality, that means they're going to be living in an environment where they have to practice a strong restraint, self-restraint, and a strong self-denial. That means they've got to understand the value of asceticism, and they've got to commit themselves to it. Would you expect to run a 26-mile marathon without learning how to walk 3 miles before? And yet, what we do, we thrust our kids into the world who have very little training gradually in developing an ascetical worldview, and then expected to be ascetical professionals when they're facing the challenges of the Christian way of life out there. Here's my question I have with people. We need to have a development, I think, of growth in asceticism, in the same way that we take growth in physical health and physical abilities as a gradual thing, athletic training. We've got to start doing that with asceticism. And by the way, most of you know this. The Greek word, askesis, from which our asceticism comes from, was the term that athletes used in Greece to describe the training for athletic competitions. Asceticism, askesis, was physical training to prepare for competition. We need to have programs and a process and a gradual development in a spiritual training that trains people to be effective ascetics in the kind of competition for spirituality that they're going to encounter in the world. I'm not sure how to do that, but I think it needs to be done. And we need to give that some a lot of attention. So, by the way, if you become an ascetic, you're overcoming this me first, me most, me always. I want what I want, forget about what everyone tells me. Autonomy is something that you learn to control with asceticism. And heteronomy, you become obedient to a view of a self-denial and self-discipline, not because someone's telling you to do it, that would just be heteronomy, but because you yourself are committed to it. So it's a way of adopting heteronomy through the lens of your own autonomy. You see my point? And that'll make it work. There's the athletic analogy, which I've already used. By the way, so many recent inquirers and converts are really seeking this. If you notice, sometimes when some of the seekers come in, I talk about them as if they were spiritual, it's like they're engaged in a spiritual triathlon. They want to know if this is a problem in the first Lent that they go through, where they try to keep all the fasting perfectly. It makes your teeth itch because they're reading all the labels to make sure there are no animal products and jello and stuff like that. But I'm telling you, they want that kind of struggle. It's like going through an athletic training and actually getting a high on the training. Now, that has to be tempered with good spiritual direction, but it should be encouraged, and it shows that the need for that kind of training is very real. All right, second thing we have to do to sort of cultivate a sincere, authentic, intellectual affirmation of faith, and I'm going to say this and not stand apart. I'm not going to stand and put my life on the line. We need to depoliticize religious education because there's so many wackos in our culture today who use religion only as a sacralization of their political worldview and their ideological biases. And therefore, they use religion as a way to give divine validation to what they want. All right? This must stop. And it certainly should not be what happens in our Orthodox churches. I got news for you. So far as I know, God is not a card-carrying member of any political party. All right? But I do know this. Our God has a moral system and moral values, and we have to train ourselves in those, and we have to be objective and merciless, but also very sort of even-handed in bringing the values of Christianity to bear in public life without doing it just as an agent of one political party or another. And if that happens in religious formation, the depoliticization fosters an openness that really, I think, is going to be nothing but constructive. So, we need to emphasize healthy identity formation. By the way, I just went to Michael Backlig's presentation on Amen, on the idea of formation of a healthy Orthodox understanding of identity for men. And I'll tell you, it's an excellent presentation, and this is a good example of this. To be a healthy Orthodox Christian man doesn't mean that you buy into the toxic masculinity that you see on the part of many people, or to the anti-masculine philosophy that other people present. Orthodox true identity for a man is somewhere in between that vast expanse, the extremes of which are both wrong. Okay? So, by the way, I think we have to entertain or help people develop a non-apophatic identity formation. What do I mean by that? We practice apophatic theology in Orthodox. We can't tell you what God is, but we can tell you what God is not. So we see God as immortal. We can't tell you how long he lives, but we know he's not mortal. How big is God? We can't say. He's not finite, he's infinite. But we use negatives to describe who God is because we can't really say cataphatically, positively what he is. I am very suspicious of people who, when you ask what they are, and they begin this way. What am I? I am not, and they tell you what they're not, without really giving you a firm understanding of who and what they are. You see, that kind of identity formation is just a reaction against something, not a movement toward and embraces something positive. And that's what we have to focus on to give, I think, a good intellectual aspect of faith. Orthodoxy's purpose is not trashing all the others, but providing a still more excellent way. When people come to me when they're leaving a religious tradition, I say, I will not meet with you to discuss becoming Orthodox until you tell me 3 things about your former religious tradition that you found to be valuable. Tell me those things that have been valuable, and we'll build upon that. And St. Paul did that. At the beginning, the introduction to 1 Corinthians 13, which you know is that ode to love. Love is patient, love is kind, love is not on the earth. The introduction to that at the very end of chapter 12 of 1 Corinthians, and now I will show you a more excellent way. That's what Orthodoxy has to present itself to be. And the religious identity we seek to establish is not something that trashes all others, but shows whatever good there might be there, we recognize that now this is a more excellent. There's a difference there. And I think that basic attitude of the difference can make all the difference in how people develop. By the way, Eugenia Constantinou has written a book. Have you seen this, Thinking Orthodox? It's a wonderful book. And basically what she says is, to think Orthodox does not mean trashing others. It means to embrace a worldview that takes the good and then perfects it in the light of Orthodox teaching. This is a book you should look at. She is, I think, a presbytera. She's also a trained counselor. So she's really someone who has the CV, the curriculum vitae, for really being an expert on this. Thinking Orthodox, very good thing to look at. All right, and then the second, how do we cultivate the experiential, the hard aspect of faith to make it productive? All right, this is important. This is another one of my favorite passages from the New Testament. I remember when I first used this in a retreat, people gasped. He said, that's in the Bible? It seems like it's a description of the news today. But here's what it says in 2 Timothy, chapter 3, verses 1 to 5. But understand this, that in the last days there will come times of stress. Ringing true so far? Men will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents. You still with me? Ungrateful, unholy, inhuman, implacable, slanderers, profligates. Still with me? Fierce, haters of good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, holding the form of religion but denying the power of it. Can you believe that? And I love the phrase, what's the basic error of all of these people? They hold, sometimes very adamantly, to the form of religion but deny the power of it. People want a religious alternative that is powerful, that enables them to change themselves and potentially through themselves to change the world. They want a power there, and I don't blame them. Why invest in something that has no power? And for all these people just described in this passage that deny the power of religion by holding the form of it but denying the power, look what the advice is. Avoid such people. There went 30 to 50% of my friends. All right? But this is something that we have to take seriously. People want a religious tradition that manifests with power. And I think That's what a lot of people now discern in Orthodoxy. A few other things, and this is related to this. Stress the transformative power of the Orthodox patristic tradition. If you really study the fathers, and you study their spiritual insights and their directions, you're going to be a different person. You're going to change. You can't help but change. That's the basis of Orthodox pastoral care. And I don't mean just quoting fathers. I mean digesting what they say and looking for ways to implement it. Okay? For us, salvation is not a legal process of getting under the wire to get into the kingdom of heaven, fulfilling all the legalistic prescriptions. The work of Metropolitan Hierophilus Vlachos says it all. His book, that famous book many of you probably have, called Orthodox Psychotherapy. All right? And his basic point is, we understand salvation is healing. It's therapeutic. You're dealing with anxiety, you're dealing with resentment, you're dealing with anger, you're dealing with lack of purpose. Orthodox patristic theology helps you to overcome these things. And this is the work that I'm talking about, very influential work. By the way, I mentioned this last time, but I'll say it again. I gave a number of retreats on anger as a pastoral issue. First to the clergy on the West Coast, and I must have repeated certain parts, if not the whole thing of that retreat, at least 5 times. Because people are dealing with anger all the time, and they want to know how they can deal with it. The patristic insights into this is just totally remarkable. And, you know, our theology and our pastoral practice is based on virtues. And if you have a sort of practice of spiritual maturation that negates the vices and cultivates the virtues, that's going to convince people of the force and the transformative power of religion. And this is the last thing I want to talk about. If one of the major aspects of truth, faith, is trust, what we have to do is build communities where trust flourishes, where it's established. The only way we can understand trusting God is by basing it on an analogy we have of trusting in other people. So, here's what I would say. The major purpose of our parishes, I would say this is going to be something that's going to draw some disagreement, is not to build great physical plants, and not to have great art, and not to have great programs, but to build within the parish communities where trust flourishes. All right? If you build communities of trust in the parish, you're providing the basis for real spiritual development. Because people aren't going to find that trust in some communities except where they're really cultivated, and hopefully that will happen in the parish. Remember I told the story of George by Simeon the New Theologian, and he says, George was probably a camouflage reference to Simeon himself, had his faith enkindled and his spiritual growth enkindled because he followed the advice of a spiritual director who said, first of all, trust in God. And then secondly, he trusted in that elder who gave him that advice and his spiritual life philosophy. So I have to tell you that, notice here, he didn't talk theology about these people. He didn't talk theory to this George. He said, trust in God and trust in me. And the reason why George was able to trust in God is because he trusted in that monk. He trusted in a human being, taught him how to trust in God. And I think that's the kind of communities of trust we have to build in our parishes. And despite our obsessive busyness, we must commit to spending time with, speaking with, and listening to others. This should lead us to a more mature understanding of prayer as spending time with, speaking with, and listening to the other. And by the way, I want to say one of the most helpful resources I found recently, because we all have a commitment to want to pray, but then we don't find the time and resources to do it in a practical way. Faith Tree Resources has come up with an app and a prayer book called The Encounter. Look it up. You know, I remember how many times, beginning of every year, I said, I'm going to say morning prayers every morning and evening prayers before I go to bed every night. I would get up, take a shower, get ready to go to work. If I started the morning prayers and continued them in the typical prayer book, I would be there till after lunch. So I needed a discipline that was much more practical. This Encounter does it. And the same thing, one of the priests I now work with in Pennsylvania, he says, I'm so tired, before I go to sleep at night, I just don't have the time even to read a shorter prayer, but you can get an app from Faith Tree where the prayers are read for you and you just have to listen. He says, I do that. Sometimes I can always manage to do that. So take a look at this. I think this program goes a long way. Faith Tree, the encounter. And this is the illustration you should see. You see it has morning and evening prayers, a very practical and doable regimen of prayer for every day of the week. And finally, I think what we have to do in trying to revitalize our parishes and ourselves is give consideration to a new and actually very ancient method of rebuilding the trust necessary for faith. And that I call the synodia model. Synodia is a Greek word. Syn means with, S-Y-N means with, odia means the way of going. So a synodia means a group of people who are your fellow travelers. They're traveling along with you day by day. And you form a group of trust with these people who are experiencing the same thing that you're experiencing day to day. You put your trust in them, they put their trust in you, and you grow together. The picture here is of Papa Nicholas Lanaus, who's a modern big saint. This poor guy, he was persecuted by every church he went to. They persecuted him to death. And the bishops were mean to him too, and kept sending him to real loser parishes. He didn't have money to support himself, he was living hand to mouth, he was terrible. And so what did he do? He formed around himself a synodia, usually the pious women in these small dying parishes, and they began to grow in this little group that supported him and each other. And you know what? The little circle of the synodia grew. It expanded. And the parishes began to thrive. No program, no bells and whistles, no theatrics, but developing a community of trust with people traveling the road with you. I think that's the only way that faith is going to be reestablished in a lot of communities. When you look in your own life, isn't it true that maybe your investment in the church is really built upon your close relationship with a group of people like you, who are experiencing some of the same things on the road of life? We need to cultivate that much more. And this, I'll close with a quote from St. Paisius. I like this. Whatever you try, personally or communally, do it with humility. You can't say, this is going to work, no doubt. If you do this, it's a magic formula. You've got to, in humility, suggest what people need in order to grow. But do it without being hegemonic, as I was saying, wanting to control the other person. The difference, by the way, between a true spiritual father or mother and a fake one is the true ones don't want to be in control of other people. They don't want to manipulate them. They want to encourage them to find the way they need to go, giving guidance along the way. And I think humility is the necessary element that enables that to happen. If you want to tune into God, so he listens to you when you pray, turn the knob to humility. For on this frequency, God always operates and humbly asks for his mercy. I used this quote in another retreat. I didn't know this. Someone said, you know why he uses that image? Because when he was in the Greek military, he did not. Paisius didn't want to do things that would kill other people or harm other people, so they made him a radio operator. And so he was very much sort of attuned to how to receive messages by tuning into the proper frequency, being heard and receiving the message you need. And he used that to say, this is what true spirituality entails. The humility is what you have to tune into, and listening to God and speaking to other people. We are at a really critical stage, I think, in the spiritual development of Orthodoxy in this country and in the world and in many of our own lives. And I think what we need to do is take this full sum understanding of faith is involving both aspects of the mind and of the heart, the intellect, the assent, and the heart trust, and use both of those things to try to cultivate a community ethos and a community practice that will encourage the development of faith in our own lives and in our communities' lives. Here ended the presentation. Thank you very much. And look at this, 3:26. You have 4 minutes for questions. Any questions or comments? Yes, sir.
Could you go back 3 slides?
All right, let's see whether I can do this. 3 slides. 1, 2, 3. Is that it?
That one, thank you.
Okay. Any others? Yes, Father.
Well, when you mentioned that we have to invest on adult education more than on children, I don't know, coming from a Middle Eastern background, I kind of came to conclusion that you cannot change people after they are 40. So I am a little discouraged to invest
Okay.
my time on that range.
I hear you.
Unless they ask for it.
Ah, okay.
Yes.
2 things. You answered your own question, number 1. If they ask for it, that's what you have to be attuned to. And let me ask you this. What really transformed our patriarchy in the Middle East? I've heard this from so many people. The Haraki. This movement among young people, who, again, I remember I had students, Haraki just means movement in Arabic, for those of you who don't know it. And there was a development of this theological questing among a lot of people in the patriarchate, the homelands of the patriarchate. Many of them were young people, college students especially. And I remember I had them, and I asked, what did you do at these Haraki meetings? Oh, we read Ephraim the Syrian. We read, and these were people who were not academics, like you and I are. They didn't do that for a living. But they had questions. And you know as well as I do, when you read something with a question in mind, you find the answer because it comes out of it. Remember, how many of you, if you're older, you remember this? Remember Evelyn Wood's speed reading? God, I really was into that when I was in college. I can read this book in one day, that sort of thing. And then I took the course, and one person told me, you get letters in those days, this was before email. So we used to really get letters from people, And I opened the mailbox, I got a letter, and he said, do you read slowly when you get that letter? When you open it, does it take you a long time to get through? No, I get a 10-page letter. I'm through it in 2 minutes. Why? Because I was looking for things I wanted to see. I was looking for what was really there. I wanted to know. And so the questions I had made me read very quickly. I think it's the same thing, I think, with adults who have questions, and you answered your own question in a way. If they ask you a question, you as a resource person can provide something that they can work through with you or even independently and find answers to the questions. But you've highlighted and underscored the basic principle. True learning is based on questions. And a good teacher is someone who discerns the questions that are being asked and then gives an answer to them. So, how many of us were in courses? All of us probably have this. We're in courses that are going on and on every day about things you couldn't care less about. So will this course never end? How do I get through it, without having to spend too much time with it? Yes, Michelle.
I think that if orthodoxy is present in the household, the children will learn as much as they would in Sunday school. If orthodoxy is taught in the household, they will learn instantly more.
Bravo. You heard what he said? If orthodoxy is taught in the household, children will learn infinitely more than just going to a class. You're absolutely right, and I'll tell you why. Because if it's practiced in the household, what's the subtext of this? Gee, mom and dad and the adults in my household are taking this seriously. Maybe I should be taking it seriously too. Because now I have to tell you, I was raised Catholic, all right? So you went to Sunday school, to 2nd grade so you can make your first communion, and then you went to 6th grade so you can make your confirmation. And the way parents would convince the kids to go to classes, then after you're confirmed, you don't have to worry about this stuff anymore. Exactly the wrong perspective, all right? When parents, I wonder, sometimes I play fantasy with myself. And I say, what if in an Orthodox home, you have parents, like you two, and others who are very serious about Orthodoxy in the home, and you tell your children, they say, what are you talking about, Mom and Dad? This is not for kids. This is for you when you get older. You have to grow into this. All of a sudden, you start to wonder what it is. By the way, I do know quite a bit of Italian, at least the dialect my grandparents spoke. Why? Because when my mother and father wanted to say things to each other they didn't want me to understand, they would say it in that dialect. Oh, I understand. And I wanted to understand more. I think that would work religiously. If parents say, this is stuff that adults are concerned about, all right? The best you could do with kids, I think, is what we do in camp and what we do. And so give them a positive feeling toward the church. And give them exposure to adults who are taking it seriously and of whom they can say, when I grow up, I want to be like that. And that's what you said when you worked with your parents, right? Here you are. I never thought that they would come and you would be, you know, a choir director in a parish and the chair of, I mean, that's really something. You never learned that in class. You learned it by absorption, osmosis. These are important issues. And believe me, don't think I have all the answers, but I do have a lot of questions. And having been a priest for 40 years, these questions occur to me day in and day out, especially when I felt myself failing pastorally. I would ask myself, why? And there was always an answer that didn't come immediately that I could uncover. Brendan,
Can a link to the presentation be made available to us?
if you send me an email, I can send you, Father, maybe you can answer
Can you
that.
send it to Father James and you can address
So
it?
we have recorded both sessions, and I will ask Father Ted Pulcini privately, so I don't force him to say yes in front of everyone, for a copy of the slides with his permission and the video, and we will put something together, and we will probably have it at St. Michael's or on our YouTube channel, which will hopefully, and probably on Facebook, however my wife does those beautiful things, and it will drive people to not only our Orthodox church, but Orthodoxy in general.
And thank you for asking me privately, and I'm more than happy. Yes,
So that,
Cody.
that, quote from 1 Peter,
Uh-huh.
the meaning is hope in here rather than faith. So do you use
Listen, I think always be prepared to offer defense to the hope that is in you. Let's be honest. Our faith gives us hope.
Okay.
Without a faith that doesn't give you hope is going to die out really quickly. If you have hope, it's because your trust and your both the intellectual and the experiential affirmation, what you believe in, gives you the hope to get up in the morning and keep at it day by day. So I think it's all intertwined.
Okay.
You know, those cardinal virtues of theological virtues, they used to be called faith, hope, and love. And all of these things are intertwined. But the thing, it's interesting. Maybe you've given me an idea for the next thing I'm going to look at. We saw C.S. Lewis develop a study of that one of the theological virtues, love. I tried to work on faith. Maybe now someone needs to work on hope. In what does hope consist?
So in part 2, I started thinking about all the things you're talking about should be present in the liturgy. Like when we exchange the kiss of peace, like in our parish, the liturgy doesn't stop, but we actually physically go around. If there's good preaching, if there's good homilies, that's teaching. Hopefully in words, in the epistle. And then, when we have fellowship afterwards, hopefully it's that connection and community.
It's true that the ideal should come to quintessential expression in the liturgy and the socializing of the agape, the coffee hour afterwards, and so forth. Now, here's the question I have. The people who come to liturgy and are edified by it, uplifted by it, transformed by it, and who stay for the coffee hour, are celebrating that hope, that faith that they have. That's what it's about. And the question is, why is it that there are so many people who are not there? And I think the reason, they may have been exposed to it in a superficial way, but the real profundity, the real basis, the real roots of it, that keep the people going, who do go to meet the only God. Something was missing in the way those people who stay away today, something was missing in the way they were presented. And I think that's what I wanted to address in this. What is it that we're not addressing that would help people become part of that group of the real initiates who come to celebrate these things in liturgy and then celebrate the trust and the link with other people.
Well, I think if someone comes to liturgy and no one greets them afterwards,
Yeah.
that's a huge problem.
How many people I've heard say, well, I tried, I went to that church and no one even said hello to me. Did I go back? Maybe to aggravate them, but really not because, not because I wanted to, you know. There has to be an enthusiasm. I can walk into a parish, and I can tell what the energy level is. And it's not because the music is extravagant or the building is an architectural work of genius. Who cares about that stuff? The church flourished in the catacombs, which is basically just a glorified cemetery. All right? But you feel the energy in certain parishes. Not theatrics, not, you know, things that are sort of expressions of wealth and privilege or status. I could care less about that stuff. But I'm gonna give you one example of what I mean by this. And I'm not gonna mention the name, but those of you, some of you will know who I'm speaking about. When I became Orthodox, probably the person that was most influential to me in giving me a sense of the energy of Orthodoxy was an elderly woman who I think went to 8th grade. And she was there every Sunday, but her love and her enthusiasm and her warmth brought countless students in this parish, both from Harvard and MIT, so now you know what parish I'm talking about, to faith. All right? Why? Because of the energy and the environment there, not because of official sort of propaganda, either from the parish or the archdiocese or whatever. People are not stupid. And people who have a real need have a sense of when that need is being addressed. And they're welcome, and they are very embracing of it, you know? And I just, since our time is over, I just want to say, this was part of my experience coming back to New England. As I say, I always like to come back to New England because it's like coming home. And the kind of experience I hadn't seen faces I hadn't seen in some cases in 40 years, by the way, and rekindling relationships and reliving moments of trust and faith that led me to the church, that's the best kind of result that one can have. And I'm going back to Pennsylvania. There are good things there too. But I will take with me that kind of good experience that I hope you will continue to cultivate among yourself and with people who come in to your orbit in the parish. There's so much there. And there are so many questions that you can respond to with the resources that your parish can provide. Okay? All right.
Thank you very much, Ted. It's been an honor to have you here, and your relationship with Bishop John has brought you back home. And thank Bishop John for cultivating these early relationships in our lives and flourishing them and continuing the relationship. And I want to thank everyone for coming. I know a lot of us read books, and we watch Zoom, and we watch YouTube, and we have all these podcasts. But what I told many people when we were cultivating people to come to the PLC is, come and see an expert or someone near to be an expert and talk to him, a real live person, okay? And we can have an interaction, and we can, instead of just watching something that's recorded. So it's beautiful to have you here, and I want to thank you again. Thank you, Ted.
Shout out to